Okay, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to our second presentation in our conference online series, the Case for Open Borders. Keep in mind that if you want to participate in the Q&A session, that we've got the button down there for Q&A. That's where you put your questions. We got a change in schedule, as you can see. We originally had Jeff Tucker speaking here, but things didn't work out, so I was scheduled last. We decided to go ahead and insert me in tonight, and then we'll just continue regularly for the rest of the program as we have scheduled on our website at fff.org. I should also say that when we give you all these presentations with these speakers, you'll notice that we're not all on the exact same page when it comes to the concept of open borders. It's there's variations. Like you'll hear at least one speaker saying something about the Ellis Island form of open border system that he favors. And what he's talking about is the 19th century American system where people were, all the foreigners were funneled into Ellis Island there in New York, vetted. But the reason it's called open borders is that they would let in, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but like 98%. The only people they would rejected were in this small class of people who had tuberculosis or other communicable diseases. And as soon as they got well, if they didn't reject them, they let them through, or mentally impaired people, things like that. But as long as you didn't fall in these tiny categories, they let virtually everyone in. So you'll hear the case for that. Tonight, you'll see a different variation of this concept of open borders. Now, I want to begin by making 2 points that I have been making since the founding of the Future of Freedom Foundation and even before. And that is that point number one, the immigration control system under which we've all been born and raised has never worked. It continues to not work, and it will never work in the future. That's point number one. Now, I think everyone agrees with the first 2 parts of that point, that it hasn't worked in the past and it doesn't work. It still doesn't work. Everybody's complaining about the immigration crisis. Where the difference would be is that I think there's still lots of people, well, I know there's lots of people holding out hope that it'll work in the future. My position is it will never work at all because it's incapable of working. My second point is that in order to resolve the immigration crisis, which is ongoing, perpetual, never ending, it's been there all of our lives, there is only one solution. There's no other solution. I've been saying this for 34 years. Some people have believed me, others haven't. There is only one solution, and that is open borders. There's no other solution. If you want to get rid of the crisis, you got to go with open borders. If you don't go with open borders, you get the crisis for the rest of your life. Now, those are the 2 important points that I wish to communicate and that I've been communicating for 34 years here at FFF. Let me deal with the first point first. Let me explain why this system has never worked, doesn't work, and will never work. Now, you hear immigration control advocates or border control advocates saying that, Jacob, we need everybody to be vetted. We want everybody to be vetted, and if they don't meet the criteria, they can't come in. And that's their ideal system here. If that happened, everybody be happy. There would be no crisis. People would come to the international crossing point. They'd get vetted. They get rejected. They go back home. No problem. Okay. So they all want everyone to be vetted. They want a vetting system. Well, we've had a vetting system. Okay. We've had it since the very beginning of immigration controls. That's the system under which we've all been born and raised. Now, some of you may know that I grew up on the Texas-Mexican border. I've spent almost half my life on the border. I grew up on a farm on the Rio Grande outside of Laredo, Texas, about, I don't know, 5 miles outside the city limits, I guess. And it was adjacent to the Rio Grande, which is the border. The river is the border. we would irrigate out of the Rio Grande for our crops there on our farm. Now, the downtown area of Laredo is also on the border, and it's connected to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, with a bridge. Or there's more bridges now, but when I was growing up, it was just one bridge, the International Bridge. So it was really one great big metropolitan area divided by the Rio Grande, connected by a bridge. Now, we would, in high school, go across the river. We weren't supposed to. Our parents said before we became seniors, you cannot do this. And the girls certainly didn't have permission, but, you know, we were teenagers. We would break the rules and we go across the river. There were bars and nightclubs and floor shows and no drinking age. So it was quite an interesting place to grow up as a teenager. And when you come back across the International Bridge, they would vet you. Everybody got vetted on the bridge. Okay, they would, what's your citizenship? Are you an American citizen? Yes, sir. Get out of your car, open your trunk. They might look under your car. If you were dark skinned and you didn't speak English, they might get suspicious and ask for identification. But everybody got vetted in one way or another. It was a vetting system. It's the system that everybody treasures who favors border controls, a vetting system. Okay, so what's the problem? I mean, we've got the system that every border control advocate wants, the vetting system. Everybody that crosses that bridge and enters the United States is vetted. So there you have it. Okay, well, what would happen in the early days, somebody would realize that they're not going to get approved, okay, when they come across, because vetting means we're going to check you if you don't meet the criteria, you don't get to keep going. Well, the people that didn't get to keep going would just walk a mile. This is hypothesizing. Walk up a mile up the Rio Grande on the Mexican side, pay a guy a couple of pesos, cross in a boat, walk back on the American side to Laredo, downtown Laredo, grab the Greyhound bus, and head north. Okay. In other words, he would circumvent the vetting system. Well, people figured this out and said, well, this is horrible. People are not obeying the rules. Well, that's true. But what are you going to do about it? You see, they're breaking, but Jacob, I don't want them to break the rules. Well, yeah, I know you don't want them to, but they are. They're breaking the rules. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we'll put a sign there. Do not enter. And we'll put it in Spanish that you cannot enter the United States without permission. You have to go to the bridge. And of course, they would laugh and just do the same thing, go circumvent the bridge. Oh, well, so then we need a border patrol. That'll take care of the problem. We just get some border patrol to ride up and down the road that parallels the Rio Grande. And there was a road right near our farm. It was about, I don't know, 2 or 3 miles up from the river. It's called the Mines Road. And so they could patrol that road, or they could patrol the river itself. I mean, you could get boats and travel the Rio Grande. That was the border. But what would happen is that the immigrant that was trying to circumvent things, all he had to do was just get up to the road and watch the border patrol go by and just head on north and meet up with a buddy of his on I-35, and they pick him up and they go. Or they go to the bus station. And so you had to have border patrol now watching the bus station. Well, they finally got the bright idea of putting an immigration control station north of Laredo, about 40 miles north. So it's really a surreal sight. You come over a crest of a hill, and all of a sudden you think you're in Mexico because there's this immigration control station there. It's amazing. And they vet you there, even though you've never gone into Mexico. Every Laredoan that travels north to San Antonio gets vetted again, even though he's never been in Mexico, or at least not recently, because you got another station here. So you got a station at the bridge, and then you got another station 40 miles north. But when I was growing up, it wasn't manned all the time. So what the transporters would do, I should mention that when you have a situation like this, where a system that's controlling peaceful activity, you get a black market. Inevitably. I mean, every libertarian understands this, that you make something illegal that's peaceful, like the drug war or whatever, you're going to get a black market. So you had a black market in transporters forming here. So the transporters would go up I-35 and they'd see if the station was manned, because it wasn't always manned. And if it wasn't, or if it was, they would radio back, CB radios or walkie-talkie saying it's all clear or it's not clear. And if it was clear, all the rest of the transporters would rush on up and get everybody to San Antonio. So they finally figured out that that was going on. So they made that a permanent vetting station. Okay. So they stop every vehicle there. And if you're dark skinned, and when the bus goes up, they board the bus and they check everybody's papers. And if you don't have your papers, and generally the people who take the bus are very poor. And I should also mention that Laredo is like 95, when I was there, it was about 98% Mexican American. And so a lot of dark skinned people, and I'd say about 25% of the population couldn't speak English. And so the Border Patrol boards the Greyhound bus and asks people for papers. And if they don't have papers, they deport them, even though they're American citizens. They just forgot their papers, or they at least take them back to Laredo and detain them until they're able to prove they're citizens. So that obviously didn't work. So what they did was they started using the Border Patrol to enter onto people's ranches and farms, like our farm. Now, it wasn't illegal to hire illegal immigrants back when I was in high school. So we hired illegal immigrants on our farm. My dad did. They're the hardest working people I've ever seen, and they lived there on the farm with us. But the Border Patrol could come onto our farm whenever they wanted. Now, you might ask, how's that possible? There's the Fourth Amendment. You can't just barge into people's property without a search warrant. Oh, yes, they could. Because when the case went to the Supreme Court called it the functional equivalent of the border. All these ranches and farms on the river, and later 100 miles extending from the river or from any border. The Supreme Court called it the functional equivalent of the border. I mean, how's that for an Orwellian designation? Not the border, but it's the functional equivalent of the border because it's near the border. So they would come onto our farm. Our workers would hide. Sometimes I'd hide with them, but if they caught them, they'd bust them and they'd take them away. And if you put a lock on your gate from the highway entering onto your property, they would, and you didn't give them a key, they would just shoot off the lock. So that doesn't cure the problem, though. You still got an immigration crisis. Each time these police state measures are being done, they later had highway checkpoints that were running east-west. Like I know people in Arizona are familiar with these. This is how they caught Willie Nelson with marijuana. All of a sudden, he's driving down the interstate going west, I think, and there's a checkpoint. And the reason this is so important is because of the police state aspects of it. You see, in a free society, you don't have highway checkpoints or, I mean, I've been to Cuba. They have these kind of checkpoints in Cuba, but we've become so accustomed to them, especially on the border, that people think it's part of a free society. And they've been inculcated with that mindset. There's also roving Border Patrol checkpoints because the fixed checkpoints were still not fixing the problem. And that's the thing to keep in mind here. Every time they enact these police state measures, they don't work. The immigrants always find a way around them. So they had roving Border Patrol checkpoints where they just stop anybody they want at random. And I was the victim of one of those in high school. A guy just pulls me over. I was going to the Port Aransas near Corpus Christi, and guy just turns on his light and says, "Open your trunk." I said, "What are you stopping me for?" He says, "Open your trunk." He wasn't stopping me for anything except to open my trunk. I mean, this is what it's like to live under a police state. So you got warrantless searches, warrantless stops. Then somebody got the bright idea that, okay, these people are hiring illegal immigrants. They're coming into here to work. They're stealing jobs from Americans. So what we're going to do is we're going to make it illegal to hire illegal immigrants. Okay, we'll make it a felony offense to hire an illegal immigrant. Because if they don't have jobs, they're not going to come. And so they made a felony. And so then you get violent raids on American businesses. And then that produces the whole fraudulent document industry, where people start producing in a black market fake documents, so that the employer can say, okay, you're good. I hire you, because employers love to hire these illegal immigrants because they're hardworking. So they never have trouble finding jobs. It's kind of interesting. Even in periods of unemployment, they're able to find jobs that the government says don't exist because people love to hire them. And then they made it a felony to transport illegal immigrants. If they can't get transported to the north, that the problem's cured, right? Then harboring, which includes renting to them or providing housing. If they don't have a place to live, they're not going to come because they'll get busted if they're out living on the streets. And even if you care for immigrants, there's a felony too. They recently prosecuted a guy in Arizona for giving food and water and letting them into his building. And they called it harboring and they caring for immigrants, and they prosecuted the guy. And it was a remarkable case of jury nullification because the jury came back in with a not guilty verdict. They arrested a woman who's attorney for the state, a state's attorney. She saw this emaciated girl on the side of the road with a couple of guys, and she was clearly sick. The woman feared that she might die. And she put her in her car, and the Border Patrol came along, or some officials came along, and they arrested the lawyer for harboring and transporting illegal immigrants. But this is what happens. The more controls they put on, the more police people start taking bigger chances. So there's drownings in the Rio Grande. There's dying of thirst on lonely deserts in the Southwest. They find all sorts of skeletons in there. And then you've got the Berlin Wall that Donald Trump built partially, eminent domain stealing of people's property. It's difficult to tell you how important people's land is that's on the river. And some of them have had this land for generations down there in the Rio Grande Valley, McAllen, Brownsville, and so forth. And the government just comes and steals their property and then separates them from the river. So there's like this gap where the wall is, and all kinds of effects on the environment and on wildlife. And then now you've got this concertina wire, and none of it has worked. You see, none of it has worked. And we all know that. Everything, but they don't repeal any of their police state measures. They always keep every single police state measure. I mean, because you could go and say, well, it didn't work. Can you now re-legalize hiring of illegal immigrants since it didn't work? No, we got to keep those there. We're just going to have to pile on to those. And so you end up getting a fully militarized, they're talking about sending the military down there, fully militarized deal. Now, the reason for this is socialism. That what a lot of Americans, especially libertarians, don't realize is that this is a socialist system because the government is centrally planning this entire system. It comes up with this arbitrary number of immigrants. But in a free market, that number might be less than what the free market would produce. In a free market, there's free flows. People figure out there's job opportunities over here. They might be temporary. Some guy is going to lose his crop in Washington State of strawberries if it's not harvested immediately, and the price system, people immediately go up there. And the central planner says, no. You have to wait for us, and we're going to decide how many immigrants and what type of immigrants, and they're never going to pick the lower economic classes. They don't want those, the teeming, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores, like on the Statue of Liberty. They want the educated ones, the ones with money, the well-to-do ones. And so the balance of supply and demand in the arbitrary plan doesn't match. And this is what Ludwig von Mises, the economist, free market Austrian economist, said produces planned chaos. That central planning always produces planned chaos. And that's what we've had on the border all my life. And not just the 34 years that I've been with FFF. All my life, I've seen this chaos. I mean, this stuff where they were coming into our farm was in the 60s. But, and I don't remember much about the 50s because we didn't move out to our farm till I was around 12 or 13 years old or so, which was already in the 60s. But this chaos has been going on a long time. The Border Patrol, the abuses of the Border Patrol. And it's because the number of people that want to come in is bigger than what the central planners have allotted. And they're different from what the central planners have allotted. So you're going to have an imbalance there. And sometimes it's aggravated by the fact that the U.S. is imposing sanctions, economic sanctions on countries like Venezuela, that with the idea they're trying to target the Venezuelans for death and suffering so that they'll have a violent revolution against their ruler. And so they're faced with a choice. Do we die of starvation or do we get out of here? And they decide to get out of there they got children. They don't, that's their choice. And so they come to the United States, and that actually magnifies the imbalance of the central plan versus how a free market would operate. Or the government's drug war is a major cause of why people leave countries in Central or South America and Mexico and try to make it into the United States. Some little 15-year-old girl is told by a drug cartel, you either come and work for us or we're going to kill your parents or your brother or kill you. And the parents say, well, no, we're not going to have that. And so they leave and they escape. And of course, when they get here, the U.S. and a lot of the Border Control advocates say, tough luck, send them back. They die, they die. That's just the breaks. They have a choice. They could oust their ruler from power. But that's why there will always be a problem. Why? Because there's always going to be people that want to come in. It's human nature. People want to save their lives. They want to improve their lives. As long as the U.S. is relatively more attractive. Now, it's been said, oh, well, the whole world would come here, Jacob. And there's this great big catastrophic thinking, oh my gosh, the United States is better than every country. Well, value is subjective, okay? Not everyone agrees with that. I once talked to a guy in Mexico who had worked up here and in Texas and California. And I said, why'd you go back to Mexico? And he says, because I love Mexico. He says, I love living here. I would never want to live in the United States. And I think that applies to a lot of people, that even though the United States might be on, from far away, hey, this is a great place. Moving to a different country is not for the faint of heart. Even Americans who go to foreign countries where they don't speak English are sometimes after 3 weeks ready to come home. But to go to a country and leave family and culture and language, and to go to a country where you got to get a job and people abuse you and insult you, and it's not as easy as it sounds. So not everyone wants to come to the United States, but in fact, there's people leaving the United States. There's some libertarians that are saying time to get out because of the oppressive nature of this welfare warfare state and homeland security and the foreign policy and getting us closer to nuclear war with Russia and Ukraine and so forth. They're getting out. Well, more than 1 million Americans are now living in Mexico. Okay, they've left. So there's always going to be people that want to come in, and so that's why it's never going to work, because central planning doesn't work. Central planning, which is a socialist measure, is inherently defective. It will never work. So 4 years from now, I will be saying to you the same thing I've said for the last 34 years. This system isn't going to work. And it hasn't worked. I'll tell you that in 4 years from now. This system didn't work for the past 4 years. And I'm going to keep saying it till the day I die. This system will never work because socialism is an inherently defective paradigm. People say, oh, no, Jacob, it's just broken. No, it's not broken. It's inherently defective. Something that's broken might be able to be fixed. Something that's inherently defective cannot be fixed. All right, so that's point one. What about point two? Open borders, the only solution. Now let me emphasize this. I want it to sink in. There is no other solution. Oh, let me go back to point one for a minute. Why do I emphasize this point? Well, because I think that if people finally come to the realization that I'm right on this, they may not, go for open borders. This might be too radical for them, but I think it would tend to give people less angst, more inner peace, if they finally came to the realization, Jacob, you're right, this thing will never work. I've seen this phenomenon with the drug war. People used to have the same angst about the drug war not working that they do with immigration, the immigration control system and border control system. I mean, they get paced the floors, Jacob, it's not working, the drug cartels and the violence, and they get all upset, and you don't see that much anymore. People know it doesn't work. It hasn't worked, and I think most people realize the drug war will never work. I mean, you have these record drug busts, and the newspaper reports a record drug bust and a new jail sentence and drug lord, and it's really all a big yawner because everybody knows it's just going to keep going. And so they at least have that that sense of peace about it. They're not ready for drug legalization. That's too radical for them. But at least they're not depressed and anxiety filled because of the failure of the drug war and the fact that it'll never work. That's what I think the advantage of point one is that if people finally realize, this guy Jacob is right, this system will never work, that at least gives people a sense of, okay, I don't need to get all riled up. Oh, Joe Biden's letting in the immigrants, and my God, they're coming to get us, Jacob, and the invaders are here. And I mean, I marvel at this anxiety and depression and fear. So that's with respect to point one. Point two is the only solution there is. Okay, there's no other solution. Somebody just wrote me an email, very critical. I'm used to it on the immigration issue. I've been getting these for 34 years, as you can imagine. That said, your position on open borders, that's just stupid. And so I wrote back, I said, well, which is stupider? Hewing to a system that has never worked, doesn't work, and will never work because it's incapable of working, or embracing a system that has worked, does work, and is the only solution to resolving this crisis. Now, when I talk about open borders, I'm talking about, just picture our domestic system. That's open borders. Now, we've all been born and raised under this system. Domestic borders between the states. We have open borders. There are no restrictions. And people from Maryland every day, I think it's tens of thousands, I could be wrong, at least thousands, cross the Potomac and enter Virginia. Nobody monitors them. Nobody checks them. Nobody vets them. They could be having COVID. They could have tuberculosis, murderers, robbers, thieves, terrorists, drug dealers, Muslims, illegal immigrants, all kinds of dangerous people you see are supposedly dangerous people. Communists could be coming in. Nobody bats an eye. Nobody says we need to vet this. In fact, the entire state of Maryland, nobody can deny this, that there is a possibility that the entire state of Maryland, everybody in it could suddenly move to Virginia. Do we have the infrastructure for something like that to handle all that? I mean, do we have the jobs? I mean, you can't deny it's a possibility. So maybe we need those border controls just to play it safe. Well, notice also that we don't worry about a trade deficit between Virginia and Florida. Oh my gosh, Jacob, there's a trade deficit. Oh, we got to do something, Jacob. We're going to go bankrupt with this trade deficit. Nobody even asks that. Nobody cares. Because we've all been born and raised under this system. If we had had a border control system domestically with a border guard around every state, border fence, border patrol, we'd have the same kind of chaos we have on the southern border. Exact same. And then if I were to come along and say, why don't we have just open borders between the states? The border control advocates would go ballistic. Oh my gosh, you would let anybody from Maryland into Virginia? What if they all come, Jacob? What if they come with diseases? Oh my gosh, Jacob, you libertarians are so impractical. And I would say, but it's the only system that works. And of course, see, a lot of it is, what were you born and raised under? Now, when I was a kid in Laredo, we celebrated George Washington's birthday celebration. We're the only city in the United States that does that, which is kind of ironic because Laredo was a part of Mexico. But we have a big parade with floats, and the debutantes in town are on the floats. The parade is led by Pocahontas on a horse, and we've got a jalapeno festival, and we had mariachis when I was growing up in the plaza downtown, San Agustin Plaza. And this is going to come as a shock, but every George Washington's birthday celebration, they would open the bridge. The immigration service and the bridge officials and the border patrol would stand down. Everybody from Mexico could come into the United States to participate in the celebrations. Okay? Now, the Rio Grande didn't dry up. The city didn't cave in. And the city was crowded with all these people. It was an open bridge. And if you were walking around San Agustin Plaza and you were listening to the mariachis, everybody speaks Spanish. You couldn't tell who was an American and who wasn't, because everybody in Laredo was Mexican American, or 98%, and most of them spoke Spanish. In fact, when I went back to practice law, and when we'd select juries, the jury panel, about 20-25% couldn't speak or write English. and the judge would just politely thank them for their service and excuse them. So, you'd walk around San Agustin Plaza, you couldn't tell who was a Mexican and who was an American. Nobody cared. When they're watching the parade, you'd look around and people speak Spanish, but people speak Spanish in Laredo. As ordinary conversations, everyday conversation. So nobody cared who was a citizen and who wasn't. It's like it didn't matter. You're just dealing with human beings. And that's like when you deal with in Virginia, you don't say, are you from Maryland? I can't deal with you if you're from Maryland. Or you don't say, are you an American citizen? I don't know of anybody that asks people their citizenship. You see a guy at McDonald's standing in the back making burgers, speaking Spanish. You don't go and say, hey, can I see your papers? I got to make sure you're legal here. And so that's how open borders work. They create harmonies among people. They create prosperity because people are pursuing economic activity that is in their best interest as they see it. It's a very harmonious system. It's the only system that works, and it's the only system that's consistent with religious principles. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. All the deaths and the suffering would immediately evaporate. No more police state. Police state, of course, is the opposite of a free society. You wouldn't have a police state. It's just, you're now just dealing with human beings, and the flows of people back and forth become normal. They become natural, just like they are between the states where we don't monitor it. But it's just a part of life where people are crossing borders back and forth, visiting, investing, touring, working, whatever. And so the crisis totally disappears. It's like drug legalization. And libertarians can relate to that because we know that if you legalize drugs today, there'd be no drug war crisis tomorrow. There'd be no cartels anymore. The same thing with immigration controls. You lift all the controls. You don't have the illegal black market transporters anymore. You don't have the deaths crossing the desert or drowning the Rio Grande. You have just normal flows of people responding to laws of supply and demand. So that's how open borders work. Let me emphasize again, it is the only solution. There is no other solution. You want to get rid of the immigration morass, it's the same solution if you want to get rid of the drug war morass. Legalize drugs, legalize the free movements of goods, services, and people across borders. All right, how are we doing? Okay, half an hour. Let me address some of the common objections. I'm sure they'll come in with the questions, but Jacob, they're going to come to get on welfare. As long as we have a welfare state, we can't have open immigration. And Milton Friedman's famous for that, libertarian, Nobel Prize winning economist. And that's one of the big arguments that I'm always hearing, that you can't have open borders with a welfare state. Of course you can. Why can't you? I mean, the idea is, well, they'll come to get on welfare, and therefore that will increase taxes. And then we're going to have to pay higher taxes. That's the argument. So, okay, you pay higher taxes, but that doesn't mean you can't have open borders with a welfare state. You have open borders with the payment of higher taxes. So that's really the argument that they're using, that they don't want to pay higher taxes. And so we have to have this massive socialist immigration control system. Well, like I say, I grew up on the border. I dealt with illegal immigrants a lot. When I went back to practice law, I asked the federal judge to appoint me to represent illegal immigrants for free in the federal court system. And so I had a lot of clients that were illegal immigrants and transporters. And I have never, ever met an illegal immigrant that came here to get on welfare. Okay. They come here to make money. And everybody knows you don't get wealthy on welfare. And so the welfare-minded person that's oriented toward welfare is not the type of person that's going to pick up stakes and go to a country, especially since there's a period of time where he's not entitled to welfare. He's going to have to get a job, like 3 years or whatever. That your vast majority of people, let's say like 95%, are coming to work. And I'm not one for studies and reports and stuff, but you can find any kind of studies, the Cato Institute, Reason Foundation, that argue that the tremendous prosperity that comes from the 95%, let's say, far outweighs the additional tax burden from the 5%, hypothesizing 5%, that are going on welfare. Because they're producing all this prosperity that's generating tax revenues that covers those people. But for me, as a libertarian, I say we should never abandon our principles and never trade our principles. Well, once you give up your principles, and you join the status because they've manipulated you into doing that, you're done. You can forget about a free society. And that's our goal as libertarians. We want a free society. And a free society necessarily means the lifting of all infringements on freedom. So it means dismantling the welfare state. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of libertarians that don't want to do that. They want to phase out the welfare state over the next 25, 30 years. And then they say, oh, but we can't have open immigration for the next 20, 25 years because they're using their support of the welfare state as the excuse. Well, look, if you believe in border controls, fine. That's one thing. Just independently of the welfare state. Jacob, I want border controls. Okay, fine. They're not going to work, but you understand that. I've already told you that. But then there's immigrants who say, well, Jacob, if we didn't have the welfare state, I'd support open borders. Well, what they've done is they've manipulated you into abandoning your principles, manipulated you into, because you agree with me that a free society is necessarily open borders, the free movements of goods, services, and people across borders. And they've manipulated you with their welfare state into joining them. And the same argument could be true of the drug war, that if you legalize drugs, many of the drug addicts are going to use Medicaid to go on treatment plans. So we libertarians are going to have to support the drug war until Medicaid's abolished. Well, that could be forever. So you've got this spectacle of where libertarians are now supporting the drug war and immigration controls both. So I say as libertarians, we got to stick with our principles and keep making the case for liberty all across the board. And if theoretically that were to result in higher taxes, then so be it. That's a better choice than abandoning principles for the sake of security. That famous saying, trading liberty for security, for the pretense of security, because you never get the security. They keep pounding all these security measures and they don't work. So you don't get the security anyway. So I say we got to stick with our principle and then focus on ending the wrongdoing, making the case not only for open borders, but making the case for voluntary charity, dismantling the coercive welfare state. Now, somebody heard me say this is, oh, Jacob favors taxation. No, I don't favor taxation. I'm saying that if that's your choice, that stick with your principles, and because once you adopt this entire system, because 5% are going to go on welfare, you've destroyed the rights and liberties of the 95%. What have they done? They're not going on welfare. Well, why hurt them? And why hurt American employers who want to hire them and people who want to associate with them? So you've destroyed all these rights and liberties for fear, and I think it's an unfounded fear, that taxes are going to rise because of this small percentage that is supposedly going to go on welfare, when you can just focus on ending the welfare. What's another one? The whole world will come here, Jacob. The whole world. We can't handle this. Well, it's easy to come up with these catastrophic thoughts. And the reason is because, you see, you have this backlog there on the border because of the central planning. And so you see this backlog and you think, oh my gosh, the whole world wants to come here. No, it's just the backlog. And I don't know how many it is, but supply and demand ferrets all that out. And this is where you have to recapture your faith in freedom and free markets. For the last 10 years, there have been people flooding into Austin, Texas, principally, from what I understand, California. They're escaping California, just like people escape Venezuela. And they're flooding into Austin. Well, my gosh, what happens if the entire state of California floods into Austin? You can't deny it's a possibility. Okay, it is a possibility. Well, life doesn't work like that. There's a lot of people that like living in California, even though I've lived in Austin. I was there for 3 years in law school. It's the greatest city in the United States, I mean, bar none, I guarantee you. But not everybody wants to move there because they prefer where they're living. And that's the way life is all over the world. We don't want to move to Austin, Texas, but I'm telling you, it's a fantastic place. I don't want to move to Austin, Texas. And as people have moved to Austin, prices have risen. That's supply and demand. It's very difficult to buy a house now in Austin. It's very expensive. Wasn't like that 10 years ago. So people look elsewhere. You see it in Florida. People from New York and New Jersey are escaping those Venezuelan states, and they're going to Florida. But Florida's expensive. It also has hurricanes. So they stop along the way. South Carolina or North Carolina or whatever. They find little towns there that are cheaper, easier to get to, and more pleasant, and they stop and settle there. everybody's got different reasons. They'll bring diseases in, Jacob. They'll bring diseases. I just got an email from a guy saying, "Oh my gosh, all that trash refugee refuse," he said, in Mexico, they're going to bring their diseases. Well, there's 1 million Americans living in Mexico. Okay, they've chosen to leave the country, and they haven't, assimilated. That's another argument that people aren't assimilated. Those Americans are not assimilating in Mexico. Who cares? They're not learning Spanish. They're not eating Mexican food every day. They're eating burgers. They send their money back to the United States. They use bank accounts. They watch the Dallas Cowboys or the American sports teams, and who cares? And they could get the diseases from those dangerous Mexicans down there, and they could bring those diseases back. So maybe we need controls on the border in both directions, not just one direction. We need to control Americans and order those 1 million Americans to come back home for their sake and for our sake. I think we should stop vacationers from going to Cozumel and Cancun. Hey, they can catch a disease. You can't deny it. And they could bring it back. And I should mention also that when Americans come back into the United States, because of these border controls, which to me is so bizarre, they're subject to being searched. Pat down searches, they're strip down searches, searching cell phones and computers. And why? Why do you give up your rights to privacy just because you've gone to Mexico for vacation? Because of border controls. They'll steal jobs from Americans. Okay, there's no question that immigrants will impact a certain sector, especially at the lower economic end. There's, let's say, Americans picking crops in Oregon, strawberry crops, let's say. And these immigrants come in and they work for less money. Okay, they've cost those Americans those jobs. Well, those Americans have high school education, presumably. They speak English. So what happens is, they're displaced. But now these immigrants are bringing in prosperity. They're buying clothes, they're buying automobiles, they're buying housing, renting housing. Those sectors now start expanding. Help wanted signs pop up. That's where those displaced workers go. So they end up in a better job, more suited to their education, to their skills, and getting paid more money. Throughout history, I mean, the best period of time is this open border system, the Ellis Island system in the 1800s, especially in the late 1800s. The 1890 to 1910 is my favorite time in history as far as freedom is concerned. Wasn't perfect. We know there were exceptions, but that factor of open immigration, it was the most prosperous period in history. I mean, I read somewhere that real wage rates doubled, and then somebody had told me they doubled again. Real wage rates, because you had sound money, you had no Federal Reserve, no paper money, no income tax, no Social Security, no Medicare, and no immigration controls, except the Ellis Island system. And that was a factor in producing the wealth. People say, oh, no, more people is a burden. Notice what my former colleague Sheldon Richmond, fellow libertarian, once said, that notice it's only the public sector that complains about too many customers. It's, oh my God, they're a burden. Do you ever see Walmart complaining about too many customers? Oh my gosh, we can't handle more people at Walmart, Jacob. My gosh, we need to do something. No, it's only the public sector, the public school sector, the welfare sector, the highway sector. They always complain about too many customers, you see. But it actually, the division of labor produces, through the regulation of the free market, tremendous standards of living. Argentina copied our system in around 1900 with virtually no immigration controls, Ellis Island kind of system. Before too long, Buenos Aires was the second most prosperous city on the eastern seaboard, second only to New York City. So that's the system I'm talking about in terms of open borders. Those are some of the principal objections. Let me repeat my 2 points. Let me just wrap up with my 2 points. The current system that we have, that we've been born and raised under, has never worked. Doesn't work today. Everybody acknowledges that. It will never work, period. 4 years from now, we'll be back here. I'll be doing this show, and I'll be telling you, I told you that. It didn't work, did it, for the last 4 years, okay? And then the only system that works, if you want a system that produces economic harmony, economic prosperity, and freedom, and is consistent with religious principles, there's only one solution. That's open borders. Let's do some Q&A. All right, let's go. Oh gosh, lots of questions here. Okay, first one dealt with the Corvettes that we were talking about. Let me leave that alone. Okay, thanks again as last week for doing this. This user is very passionate about open borders. Actually, no borders in the communal property since it only being private property. Let me clarify this. That's another objection that, oh, you libertarians don't believe in borders. That's nonsense. That's a myth. We believe in borders. We just want people to be free to cross them. When they cross the border between Maryland and Virginia, the border stays. The Potomac is there. You're just subject to a new jurisdiction when you move into the new jurisdiction. Would the team at some point talk about company towns like Milton Hershey had and famously did not fire a single employee from during the Great Depression? The example during the quest line, Sultana's Resolve and the Computer Morgue Final provides a good illustration. Well, let me defer to that because it doesn't really deal with immigration as such. We could deal with that. But in a free society, people are free to organize anything they want, including those company towns. And they were very efficient. They had their own currency and so forth. But let me keep going. Will Jeff Tucker be speaking at some point? No, he's not going to be on the agenda. Things just didn't work out. He's a true hero of humanity. He absolutely is. He and I are good friends. Okay. Let me see. Second semester college geography professor told stories of how they would decades ago also cross El Paso into Mexico to party and then come back the same day, all with no problem. Okay, I didn't know that. Same principle. People don't realize that in these border communities, there's a camaraderie. I mean, there's families on both sides of the river. Remember, this was part of Mexico. It wasn't Laredo, Texas, except Laredo, Texas, which was part of the province, a province in northern Mexico, but it was all part of Mexico. And so people in Laredo have family members across the border. They have houses. People in Nuevo Laredo have houses in Laredo. It's a very interesting culture that you can't find anywhere else in the United States. Okay, somebody says this sounds Orwellian. I don't know what that means. Somebody uses a bad word or initial for a bad word. The CBP for doing that. Learn in the college they can let their drug-sniffing dogs on a long leash on top of somebody's property where they couldn't go to look for probable cause to enter. Yeah, I mean they look for ways to violate the Fourth Amendment, the privacy that comes with the Fourth Amendment. And the one time where they busted our workers, I mean, these guys were our buddies, my brothers and I. We worked in the fields with them, baling hay, and they played football with us after work was over. We had dinner with them. They lived there with us. They were our buddies. I was in high school, and when the Border Patrol caught these guys and started to load them up, I mean, my brothers and I had tears in our eyes because we knew we'd never see them again because they can't afford to try to come back a second time because then it becomes a felony, and they would send them away to jail. And I'm sitting there saying, that's why when I got back to Laredo, I went to the federal judge. First thing I did was make an appointment with the federal judge saying, I want to represent illegal immigrants and transporters. I'll do it for free because I just was so outraged at what they were doing. And when I was a kid, this user would see day laborers at gas stations and Home Depots across Texas while living there, and that was fine. Firms can hire and fire whoever they want. Absolutely. It's their business. They can insource or outsource as they want. Absolutely. Would have responded very differently to such Orwellian acts. Well, I don't know how you'd have responded. I'm actually planning, here's another question. I'm actually planning on buying a phony passport, long desired at that, finally in order to attend a business conference in Mexico next year. I'm not a believer in this real ID BS or papers of any such kind. Well, that could be dicey. That's up to you. Somebody says exactly, just as Jeff Tucker said to InfoWars during their mini documentary on Acapulco a half dozen years ago. It's a massive land grab. Okay, anonymous attendee. Military. And who is paying for that Orwellian nightmare? The taxpayers extorted. Yeah, that's another point is that we've got this out of control debt. Everybody acknowledges that, $34 trillion in debt. Look what this system is costing in terms of taxpayer money. It started out with a very small business, border patrol, but it keeps expanding and expanding. And now they're talking about sending the military down. This costs a lot of money. I don't know what the figures are because my mind doesn't work in that direction, but it's a large sum of money to pay for this whole thing. And who's paying it? The taxpayers. And building the Berlin Wall down there, taxpayers. But they'll just add it onto the debt and they'll inflate the currency to pay for it. Okay, want the best. Only those currently wealthy wanting to stave off competition. What about the upwardly mobility? Allowing for poor people to become wealthy themselves. It's just back scratching table of monopolists. Yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of the free market is the market decides who comes in, is who's needed. I mean, I really love that Emma Lazarus poem on the Statue of Liberty. We're not interested in your storied pomp, your well-to-do. Give us the dregs of your society, your wretched refuse of your teeming shores yearning to breathe free. I love that. That people are trying to improve their standard of living, and what ends up happening, are they poor? Yeah, they're poor. They got nothing in that period in the late 19th century. They were flooding in American shores with nothing. Imagine, without a job lined up and not able to speak English. Many of them did. Um, the Italians and so forth. I'm not even sure the Irish spoke that good English, but in any event, they'd come in and they'd manage for themselves. People say, Jacob, but how are we going to take care of them? You don't need to worry about taking care of people. They can take care of themselves. Okay. Decriminalization. Stop the cartels from forcing migrants to make that decision and stress the welfare state shouldn't exist in the first place. I'll tell you, man, we got some hardcore people in this audience here. This is really cool. Absolutely. You get rid of all the transporting cartels, the drug cartels, legalize drugs, legalize the free movements of people, and then focus on the welfare state, that shouldn't exist. Because once you fall into that trap of, okay, well, we can't do this until we get rid of the welfare state, well, you become part of the problem as far as I'm concerned. Value is subjective in Austrian Economics 101. Absolutely. Value is subjective. And that principle applies to movement. People love their countries. Many years ago, when China started letting their students travel and so forth, and I don't know what the situation is too. I don't know how much freedom of travel there is in China, but from what I understand, it's pretty liberal. And everybody said, oh, people will never go back. But people do go back. It's a communist regime. It's a one-party regime, tyrannical society. But people many Chinese, millions of Chinese love living in China. They want to stay there. They'd like it to be better, just like we'd like our country to be better. Ideally, this user would have already liked to have left already. Okay, I'm not sure what that means. Just because the clergy plan is real and evident, that doesn't mean the ends justify the means. I'm not sure what that means. But it did remind me of the EU system. Before they adopted free movements of people between the EU countries, there was the same predictions of, oh my gosh, there'll be a disaster. People from Italy will go into France without restrictions. I mean, France will be destroyed. What if everybody from Italy moves to France? Because obviously France is a much more attractive country, right? So young people love it. I mean, they go into France in order to learn French. They go to French schools. They don't have to worry about border controls. They get a job there. They don't have to show an ID to get a job. It's worked beautifully. And none of the catastrophic things that they predicted came into play. Okay, New Jersey is just a license plate at that point, exactly. Citizenship is just subscriber to an expediency. All right, well, let me make the point about citizenship. Immigration is not citizenship. Okay, people should be free to cross borders, but that doesn't mean they should be free to become citizens. You can make as strict restrictions on citizenship as you want. I'm indifferent to that. You want to make it really strict to become an American citizen? Fine. So people come in and they don't become citizens. Who cares? Those Americans living in Mexico, they're not citizens of Mexico. Who cares? I had a friend many years ago that was from Japan. She'd been here 30 years or so. She spoke English with a heavy Japanese accent. And one day I asked her, I said, are you an American citizen? Her kids were Americans. They came and they went to school here, college, and her son had become a doctor. And she said, no. I said, why? She says, I want to remain a Japanese citizen. So she votes in Japan elections and so forth. She still lives here as a Japanese citizen. Who cares? I mean, I don't care. I don't think anybody that associates with her cares. Please show Warja since you made it. I don't know what that means. Okay. Communal property, such as a cross-continental weight, isn't itself a welfare state. Okay, I'm not. Oh, cross-continental wall. Well, it's public ownership, the wall, government ownership of this horrible thing. Stop and demanding taxes in the first place. Okay, not sure what that means. Principles are the antidote to chaos. Principles are the antidote to politics. I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's why here at FFF, we've emphasized the importance of principles from our very beginning, 34 years ago. That's why we present the principled case. That's why we don't compromise on any issue, including immigration. Because once people understand the principle, everything falls into place. And if we're going to achieve a free society, and I'm one of those that says it's still possible to achieve a free society, no matter how difficult it is these days. It's a lot worse than it was 34 years ago. It's still possible. But in order to do that, it's necessary to make this principal case for liberty as compared to reforming the welfare warfare state. That was terrific. Do you have a written version? Okay, no, I don't have a written version, but maybe I can put it together. Also, I think there's this very strong argument that the more open the border, the less likely we'll get into a war. Now, that's a great point. Okay, I got 4 minutes here, and this is actually the last comment or question. That's Bastiat's famous saying, if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. And the idea is that when people are free to move back and forth across borders, buying, selling, working, whatever, the incentive for going to war becomes significantly less. In fact, war becomes very costly. But when you've got these barriers, trade barriers and movement barriers between countries, war becomes easier. And also, when you have free movements of people, then you've got families and friends on both sides. And therefore, it becomes more difficult to go to war. Let me see. If the people can't cross the border for economic opportunity, they will resent the U.S. and want to take our economic wealth. What is your reaction to that? I agree. I mean, it creates that sense that, hey, I want to participate in this, and I can contribute to your prosperity. And so you lock them out and say no. I think it does create resentment. Another one came in. Open borders also works both ways. We got 3 minutes. Both ways. Yes, absolutely. Example, Venezuelans can leave Venezuela's atrocities behind, yet vote via write-in ballots from safety where they're not persecuted and send remittances to make their home countries better eventually, thus ending the migration crisis from the other end. Absolutely. I mean, you've got in Venezuela, you've got a vice that consists of socialism and U.S. sanctions, and they're squeezing the Venezuelan people. So America's a safety valve, even though we're part of the cause of the problem, the federal government's cause of the problem. You could release one half of the vice and at least relieve that portion of it. But people come over here and they advocate for change in Venezuela, and a lot of them go back if things start to improve. But it's important to have a safety valve. I know I only got 2 minutes. That safety valve was closed in World War II, and this is the point it's worth researching. Go look up the term "Voyage of the Damned" and watch the movie "Voyage of the Damned." A lot of Americans don't realize that America contributed to the Holocaust. The federal government did. When I say America, I'm referring to the federal government and federal officials, because when Germany was under Hitler was willing to let go of German Jews, and he was willing to let them go in the 1930s. Remember, the Holocaust doesn't happen to the war. America said, no, we have immigration controls. We won't take them. There's as much anti-Semitism here in the federal government as there was in the Nazi regime. And you can look that up, and it's also part of the Holocaust Museum, fortunately. So immigration controls can be a tremendous, tremendous horror story when they're abused. And of course, that applies to all government power. So on that note, it's 7:59. We'll wrap things up. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Thanks for your great support. I know this is a controversial subject, but we don't shy away from controversy here at FFF, in case you didn't know. And again, this is the only solution. So we might as well just keep making it, which we're going to continue to do. Hope you'll tune in next week, same time, same station, and for the next few weeks. The presentations, I'm sure, are going to get better. Thank you very much and have a good evening.